was 30 feet below the ridge, his legs shattered, his blood turning dark in the snow, and he was using every last piece of himself to stay conscious for one reason. Not for the pain, not for the cold. For his daughter, lying 6 feet away from him, completely still, her dark hair fanned across the white ground like a terrible painting. He could hear her breathing, shallow, too shallow, and he could not reach her. He had been trying to drag himself toward her for 20 minutes, and his body had stopped listening to him somewhere around the 15th minute, and now all he could do was watch her chest rise and fall, and pray that each breath would not be the last one. Sheriff Daniel Reeves had served this county for over 20 years. He had talked men off ledges, he had held dying strangers in the dark, waiting for ambulances that were always too far away. He had buried deputies. He had stood at the edge of other people's worst moments his entire career and never flinched. But this was his daughter. This was Emily. And lying broken in the snow at the bottom of a ravine at the edge of Widow's Peak, Sheriff Daniel Reeves was more afraid than he had ever been in his life. He did not hear the footsteps above him on the ridge. He did not see her until she was already over the edge. She came down the rock face fast and controlled, rappelling on gear that she clearly knew how to use the way most people know how to breathe, and when she landed in the snow beside him, she already had 2 fingers against his neck before he could form a single word. She had dark eyes and the particular stillness of someone for whom crisis is not an emergency, but simply a condition to be managed. She pressed something cold and firm against his broken leg and looked at him with a steadiness that made him feel, for the first time in 20 minutes, that it was possible he was going to survive this. He grabbed her wrist. He said 4 words. Cold trucks. Harland Freight. Then he said 2 more. They know. Then the darkness took him.
Her name was Commander Rachel Cole. She was 38 years old. She was an active-duty United States Navy SEAL, one of the most decorated women in the history of that program, and she had driven up to the trailhead near Widow's Peak that afternoon to do nothing more significant than walk her dog. She had not been looking for a mission. She had not been looking for a fight. She had been looking for 40 minutes of pine trees and cold air and the particular silence that is the only thing that fully quiets the part of her mind that 17 years of service had left permanently switched on. The dog had found them. Ghost was a 9-year-old German shepherd with a silver and black coat that had gone slightly lighter at the muzzle in the 18 months since his retirement from active duty. He had served 2 combat deployments alongside Rachel in environments where the wrong decision meant people died before they finished making it. He had been wounded once, a fragment to his left shoulder that healed clean but ended his clearance for further combat deployment. Rachel had adopted him the same day the option was offered, without hesitation, the way you claim something that was already yours before the paperwork existed. On the trail that afternoon, Ghost had stopped without warning, not slowed, stopped. His entire body had changed in a single instant from a dog on a walk to an instrument pointed at the ravine edge with the focused, total attention of an animal whose nose was telling him something his training had taught him to report and his instincts had taught him to grieve. Rachel had read his signal the way she read everything he communicated, not as a translation, but as a direct understanding, and she had moved to the edge and looked down, and her heart had done the thing it almost never did anymore. It had lurched. She went over the edge before she had fully processed what she was seeing. She stabilized Daniel's leg. She covered Emily with the emergency blanket from her kit and checked her pulse and found it present and placed 2 careful fingers against the wound at her temple and confirmed the bleeding had slowed. She reached for her radio and was relaying coordinates to emergency services when Ghost, still up on the ridge above her, shifted his posture in a way she recognized from 100 field exercises and 2 wars. He had heard something she had not. 2 men appeared at the top of the ridge. They were not hikers. They did not call down asking if anyone was hurt. They moved to the edge and looked over, and the expression on the face of the closer one when he saw Rachel kneeling in the snow beside the two people he had apparently believed were finished told her everything she needed to understand about who they were and why they were there. Ghost did not wait. He launched from the ridge with the explosive, controlled force of an animal that has been trained not for cruelty, but for the protection of what matters. He covered the distance between himself and the first man before the man's hand had completed its movement toward the weapon at his side. The sound was brief and decisive. The second man looked at Ghost and then at Rachel, who had already cleared her sidearm and was moving with the calm, geometric precision of someone for whom danger stopped being frightening a very long time ago, and he made the only intelligent decision he would make that entire day. He ran. Ghost held his man. Rachel secured him. The sirens in the valley below got closer. The light over the mountains went orange and then purple, and then the cold blue of emergency vehicles coming up the mountain road, and Rachel sat in the snow between a broken sheriff and his unconscious daughter and kept them both warm and breathing until the paramedics came over the ridge and took them from her hands. She sat in the hospital corridor that night with Ghost at her feet and the weight of the last 4 hours settling across her shoulders like something she had been carrying for years without knowing it had a name. Daniel Reeves woke the next morning, clear-eyed and in significant pain and unwilling to wait another hour before telling his story. He had been noticing things for several months that did not fit the picture. Harlan Freight Solutions was a regional refrigerated trucking company, legitimate on every document, moving pharmaceutical supplies and temperature-sensitive cargo through the western states. The trucks ran on time, the manifests were filed correctly, the drivers were professional and kept to themselves. That last detail had been the first thing that felt wrong. Drivers who move ordinary cargo do not keep to themselves the way these men did. They do not avoid diners and fuel station conversations with the specific discipline of people who have been instructed that being remembered is a liability. Daniel had started watching. He had noticed unscheduled stops at hours when no legitimate delivery required them. He had noticed cargo weights that did not match the logs. He had noticed refrigeration readings that were filed as standard, but that a contact at the transport authority told him privately were being manually overridden at intervals that matched nothing in legitimate cold chain operations.
He had started asking questions through careful channels. He had been warned off once, politely, by a phone call from someone who should not have known he was asking. He had kept going. Emily had found out what he was doing because Emily had grown up watching her father do what was right and had absorbed that quality so completely that she considered staying out of it an option that did not seriously apply to her. She had been helping him organize everything, cross-referencing the transport logs with county records, building something that could hold up when the time came. She had been with him the night someone decided the questions had gone on long enough and that the ravine at Widow's Peak was a more permanent solution than another phone call. Rachel sat with all of it and recognized the shape of what she was hearing. She had seen trafficking operations in foreign countries. She understood the logistics, the layering, the way legitimate business structures become cover for the movement of human beings through checkpoints and across borders and into situations that devastate every person who passes through them. This was smaller than what she had seen overseas, local rather than international, 2 or 3 states rather than multiple countries. That fact did not make it smaller in any moral sense. It made it closer. It made it something happening in a county where people coached Little League and knew each other's children by name. And that made Rachel's jaw tighten in a way that overseas operations, for all their scale, sometimes did not. She offered Daniel something clear and bounded. Not a rescue operation, not anything that would compromise the legal integrity of what needed to happen next. Observation, documentation,
the kind of disciplined intelligence gathering she had been trained to conduct and that she could provide without stepping outside the limits of what was lawful. Daniel accepted immediately. He was a man who understood the difference between help that serves justice and help that undermines it, and what Rachel was offering was the former, without question. 3 nights later, Ghost alerted outside the secondary loading warehouse on the edge of town. He did not bark. He sat. He looked at a specific sealed refrigerated trailer with the total unblinking focus of an animal whose nose was delivering information his training had taught him to communicate with absolute economy. Rachel had trusted that nose through 2 combat deployments, and she trusted it now completely. They waited in the darkness. The temperature was below freezing. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the lot with a sound like something breathing. And then, through the thin metal wall of the refrigerated trailer, something knocked. Once.
Then again. Then a sound that dissolved the last fraction of doubt about what was inside that trailer. It was crying, soft and exhausted, and stripped of the kind of hope that believes anyone is coming, which is the particular sound that Rachel had hoped after her last deployment she would never again have to hear in her life. She recorded everything, the knocking, the crying, the timing, the personnel, the license plates. She handed it to Daniel the following morning with a complete document correlating what they had observed with the records he had already compiled. Daniel contacted a state-level task force officer he had known personally for 11 years, someone outside his county chain of command entirely, someone whose integrity he would have staked anything on. It turned out that officer had been pulling at a different thread of the same network for several months and had been waiting for exactly the kind of documented evidence that was now sitting in front of him. The warrant moved through proper channels. The raid was conducted by state authorities and the task force on a cold Thursday night 3 days later. Rachel was not inside the perimeter. She stood in the dark at the edge of the operation boundary with Ghost at her side, not moving, not speaking, watching the light sweep across the warehouse lot and listening to the radio traffic and understanding with complete clarity that her being inside would have introduced a legal complication that could have given defense attorneys a thread to pull, and she was not willing to let anything she did cost those women a single chance at justice. 14 women came out of 2 refrigerated trailers that night. Several of them were under 18 years old. They came out wrapped in emergency blankets, blinking in the cold air and the flashlight beams, with the expressions of people who had stopped believing this moment was coming. Rachel watched from the perimeter and did not look away, and let herself feel the full weight of it, because she believed that bearing witness to suffering, even when the outcome is good, is something that should cost you something. Victor Harland was arrested before sunrise. 3 employees were taken into custody alongside him. Financial records uncovered over the following weeks revealed connections to a network operating across 2 neighboring states. Not a massive organization, but an established one, running long enough and quiet enough to have destroyed more lives than anyone in that county wanted to count.
It had been stopped because a sheriff had refused to stop asking questions, because his daughter had refused to stay safely home, because a retired military dog had caught a scent on a hiking trail on a Tuesday afternoon, because a Navy SEAL had gone over the edge of a cliff without hesitating and held 2 people alive in the snow until help arrived. The weeks that followed were quiet in the way that things are quiet after something enormous has moved through them and left everything rearranged. Daniel faced the long work of physical recovery and something harder than that, the guilt of a father who had placed his daughter in the path of danger, even knowing she had chosen to walk there herself, even knowing with complete certainty that she would make the same choice again. Emily faced the particular challenge of surviving something traumatic and trying to locate herself on the other side of it, which is harder than surviving the event itself and takes longer and is less often talked about.
Rachel faced an internal review from her command regarding her presence during elements of the investigation. Not career-ending, not dramatic, just the real-world reminder that even necessary things carry consequences, and that doing right and doing easy are not always the same road. Ghost became something none of them had planned for, and all of them needed. When Emily first woke in the hospital, she had panicked the way people panic when their last clear memory is darkness and danger and falling, and they open their eyes in an unfamiliar room with unfamiliar sounds and cannot immediately locate the boundary between what is over and what is still happening. The staff had managed it. The medication had managed it, but she had remained coiled tight inside herself for days, sleeping badly, sitting in rooms with the careful stillness of a person who no longer fully trusts the world to hold still. Ghost had entered her room on the second day, slowly and with a gentleness that did not look like training. It looked like understanding. He had moved to her bedside without rushing and without performing, and he had lowered his great silver and black head and rested it softly against her hand, where it lay on the hospital blanket. Emily had flinched. Ghost had stayed. She had gripped his fur, both hands, the way a person grips something real when the world has recently stopped feeling that way. Her breathing changed, not immediately, but over the following minutes it deepened and steadied and became the breathing of a person who has found, against all recent evidence, one thing they can trust entirely. Rachel watched from the doorway and did not say a single word, because there was nothing she could have said that would have improved on what was already happening between her dog and this young woman who had nearly died helping her father do what was right. Ghost stayed close to Emily through every follow-up visit in the weeks that came after, not because he was directed to, because he chose to. Because whatever Ghost understood about the world, he understood that this person was still fighting something invisible, and that his presence was a kind of armor she did not have to earn or explain or thank anyone for. At a small community gathering several weeks after the arrests, Emily stood up and spoke. She was not a polished speaker. She was a young woman in the town she had grown up in, talking to people who had watched her become who she was. And she said something that went through that room like a current and has not stopped traveling since. She said that when she woke up in the hospital, she was the most frightened she had ever been in her life. She said Ghost came in, and he did not try to explain anything or fix anything or ask her to feel better before she was ready. He just stayed. And she said that sometimes that is exactly what saving someone looks like. Not the dramatic moment, not the loudest act, just staying, just being present in the dark until the person beside you remembers how to find their way back to the light. There was not a dry eye in that room, because everyone there had lived long enough to know she was telling the truth. Every person sitting in those chairs had a moment in their life when the person who saved them was not the strongest or the most decorated or the most visible. It was the one who stayed, the one who sat beside them in the hardest hours without checking the time, the one who chose them quietly and kept choosing them without needing anything in return. Rachel completed her assignment and returned to her duties. She did not retire. She did not step away from service. She went back because the work was not finished and because the women who had come out of those trailers deserved a world that kept producing people willing to find them. But she began something alongside her service, a veterans outreach program pairing retired military canines with trauma survivors and first responders, people carrying invisible weight, people who needed what Emily had needed, not solutions or speeches or programs, just presence, just something that asked nothing and offered everything and stayed. Daniel returned to his badge after his recovery. He walked with a slight permanent limp now. He said it was a reasonable price.
Emily enrolled in criminal justice studies the following semester. She said she wanted to understand the systems well enough to fix the parts that were broken. Widow's Peak is still there. The trail still climbs to that ridge where the light falls across the valley in the late afternoon like something you would not fully believe if you had not stood there and seen it yourself. It is still one of the most beautiful places in Montana. But it is different now. It is a place where something terrible almost finished, and something necessary was instead begun. One evening near the end of that winter, Rachel sat on a wooden bench overlooking the valley below the peak. The sky was doing what Montana skies do when they are not being subtle, going from orange to deep purple to the first cold blue of early stars. Ghost lay beside her with his head in her lap, his silver fur warm under her hand, his breathing slow and full of the contentment of an animal at rest beside the person he has chosen completely. Rachel looked at the valley for a long time. Then she said quietly to the mountains and the cold and the dog who had followed her through more darkness than most people will ever know, "We are still fighting, just closer to home." There are people in this world who will never make the evening news, who will never stand at a podium to receive what they earned, who will do what is right quietly and at great personal cost simply because they have decided, somewhere permanent and unshakable inside themselves, that this is who they are. Daniel Reeves kept asking the question when stopping would have been easier and safer, and no one would have blamed him. Emily refused to stay home when staying home was the reasonable choice. Rachel went over the edge of a cliff for two strangers because that is what her life had trained her to do, and she had never once resented the training. And Ghost simply stayed beside the people who needed him, which is the oldest and most necessary form of courage that exists. The world continues because of people like this, the quiet ones, the ones who show up without being thanked, the ones who fight battles no camera records and win victories no headline announces, and carry the weight of what they have seen and done and survived with a dignity that deserves every moment of recognition we can give it. If this story moved something in you, honor it. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet courage is still courage, that service does not end when the uniform comes off, that loyalty, the deep and unglamorous and completely beautiful kind, is one of the most sacred things one living creature can offer another. Subscribe to State of Valor, because these stories deserve to be told, because the men and women and yes, the dogs who give everything for others deserve to be remembered, and because somewhere right now, someone is doing something brave and necessary and completely unwitnessed, and the very least we can do is pay attention. They earn